Hello, I'm Michael Kirkpatrick. Welcome you to what I wish somebody told me when I was a new Christian. This is Lesson 7, Part 2. And the title of the lesson is Blood Covenant Abraham. In Lesson 7, we talked about Blood Covenant David and Mephibosheth. And so I'll let you go back and review that if you care to. I'm going to proceed here, and I want to lay a foundation for this blood covenant in the Old Testament. I want to direct your attention to Genesis chapter 11. And while you're looking at that, there were three incursions into the human race that God was upset about. One was Adam and Eve, you know about in the garden, where he tempted them to eat the fruit. Second one is Genesis 6, where the angels interfered with the human race, married human women, and God did not like that, and things really began to go downhill after that. Now Genesis 11 tells us about another incident called the Tower of Babel, and while I'm fully aware of that, in process of some research, I found some things I think you'll find interesting. So let me begin there. Genesis 11:1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had slime for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach into the heavens, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now let me stop there just for a moment. They wanted to get up high so they could observe the heavens, and this basically the horoscope and the alignment of the planets and so forth. Now it said, let's make our name lest we be scattered abroad on the face of the earth. Already they had a suspicion of what was going to happen, and it follows through that it did happen. They must have had some inkling of that, and so that's eventually what God did. And the Lord came down to the city and the tower, and when the children of men, which the children of men builded, and the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Now this verse 6 is very important because for a long, long time, the forces of evil have tried to thwart the plan of God. If you want to flip over to Revelation, you can read there how the Antichrist comes and tries to gain world control. This is basically the same idea, same spirit, same attitude. It's just really early and primitive. And so the line here is important. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Now let me take just a moment to explain. When the angels were appointed to watch over the human race, they didn't do their job. In fact, they got crossways. Satan, Lucifer, if you will, came to tempt Eve and threw the human race into that situation. The giants came and married human women and produced a race of giants, which were big and mean and they vicious, and they also corrupted the human race. Then here in 11, what was happening in this realm, and we'll talk a little bit more about the participants here in just a moment, but what was happening was that they had this supernatural information. They knew all kinds of things. The more modern one might be nuclear power. And as you know, at the end of World War II, they exploded a nuclear bomb. Well, the ramifications of that are awesome. People today are literally scared to death of atomic energy, although technology has improved greatly. If you can imagine a 1940s or 1950s automobile alongside a modern automobile, you see how much has come, but how much progress has been made. But if you talk about nuclear, they're afraid. Technology has improved greatly, but they're still afraid of this. Now, there were all kinds of things that these angels taught humans like war and how to make weapons, and found foundry and metals and herbs and all kinds of drugs and that kind of thing. Then seances and hexes and potions and how to do all those kind of things. And this brought the children, the humankind down. So what God observed here is that if they're able to continue, they can accomplish anything they want. And that's the time we live in. We've seen, for instance, I'll read here in a second, he confounded the languages. But today, languages are virtually no problem. I'm not particularly adept in any language of it, but I have language translators in my computer and internet that can tell me almost what's going on in most any language. It reads, it synthesizes the translation, but still you could have a pretty good idea what's going on. It's not perfect, but it's well advanced, so that language is not a barrier anymore. Therefore, so the Lord, verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build a city. Therefore the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. Okay, so now all of a sudden they go to work one morning, and this guy can't understand this one, and this is trying to explain what we're going to do that day, and he doesn't understand, and there's no translators, and so all these languages are brand new, so there's no one to translate, and all of a sudden they can't get any work done, so they give up building the city, and they go off into several places in the earth. And so this is spoken in comes up in in Deuteronomy 32. Let me explain what happened here. As I explained about Genesis 6, the angels interfere with the human race. Now, what's happening is the angels that were in charge of all of this let these people dip into this sinful condition by letting them have information they weren't ready for. Deuteronomy chapter 32, this is the judgment of the angels that were in charge at the time of Babel. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the word of my mouth. I'm going to skip down to verse 5. Again, Deuteronomy 32, now we're in verse 5. They have corrupted themselves. Their spot is not the spot of his children. They are a perverse and crooked generation. In other words, in Genesis 6, they interfered with God's plan, and God locked those guys up. Jude tells us they're locked up in the basement of hell, a place called Tartarus, which is a Greek term, but nonetheless, you get the idea. They're bound in everlasting chains. Now, these guys that were in charge of this at this Tower of Babel situation, they didn't learn anything. And he says, you're not just children, you made a mistake. You didn't just spill the milk, you didn't just make a mess. You know what you were doing. You're a perverse and crooked generation. So now we skip down to verse 7. He said, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee the elders, and they will tell thee. In other words, this was a long time coming, but they didn't stop it. They let this corruption continue. Now, verse 8, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam and set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. So when God gave them different languages, he also gave them different regions, geographical regions which they were now in charge of. And so they were in charge to make this right, but they had turned against the Lord, so that wasn't going to work in God's favor. Now verse 8, I'm sorry, I just read verse 8. Verse 9, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. So what happened these people didn't want to serve God, and so God said, okay, I'm just going to confound the languages so you can't accomplish your common purpose, but I'm going to put you angels in charge of these regions, and they're called princes. Now, if I were to say king and kingdom, you would understand. Kingdom is the reign over which a king has authority, okay? Prince, we don't say princedom, but that's what we're talking about. They were princes over geographical areas, and they're referred to in that way. Now, Acts 17, 26. Pardon me, I know it's a little slow. Acts 17:26 says, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So Paul is saying, when God divided the nations and set out the languages, he also set the bounds of their habitation. So, the history of our country, United States of America, international travel was just getting underway, and they were beginning to cross some of these barriers, and so that's happened in latter times. But for years, the boundaries of the nations were settled. Now, Daniel speaks of this area of authority, this prince. Pardon me, I'm going to have to turn to that. I'm sorry. Let me not take the time. Daniel 10:13, it'll be in the notes in the bottom. He speaks of the prince of Persia, and he prayed because he was having some difficulty, and the prayer was delayed 21 days because the prince of Persia, which would be the prince in the air, hindered, and finally he called in the Archangel Michael, who's the warring angel, to clear the path. And finally, after 21 days, the message came through, or the answer came through, but he was delayed 21 days. But he speaks of the prince of Persia. This would be the Persian region, and they were in captivity, in Persian captivity. And so this is where they were, and so they were asking for help, but they were delayed. So now, I'm going to stop here for a moment and switch to the subject we talked about, and that is the Abrahamic covenant. So when I just read the one about, he said, so when the nations were divided, God says, my portion is going to be Jacob. Now, you remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and we then follow the children of Israel. They had 12 brothers, and you know the story of Joseph, but they go into Egypt, and they come out, they come into slavery, but they come out as a nation. So in the process, almost like a womb, he takes this family, he puts a family in, and out comes a nation, a small nation, but nonetheless a significant nation. And this is when he gathers together on Mount Sinai, and he gives the law to Moses, and he begins to give all those laws that you find in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Some tough reading, but as a new nation, they needed new laws. They were under pagan laws in Pharaoh's kingdom of Egypt, and so they had, if they came out as a nation, they had to have new laws. Now, so in that process, God is saying, now, Jacob is mine. Jacob turned to Israel, the children of Israel. And so now, as David and Jonathan enter a covenant, now God is going to enter into a covenant with Abraham, not with the other nations, but with Abraham. And now he's going to make of Abraham a nation. Let me pick up now in Genesis 15:1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. But Abraham said, Lord, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Now that was his servant. And Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. So when he brought him outside, and he said, look now toward the heavens, and and count the stars, and you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord. It was counted to him for righteousness. So God says, I'm going to make a covenant with Abram. And he's someone that I'm going to work with. I'm going to make a covenant with him, and I'm going to cause his family to grow, and then his children will come along, and they will be a part of the covenant. His grandchildren will come along, they'll be a part of the covenant. And when those families break out into tribes, and the 12 tribes of Israel, I'll be in covenant with them. When they become a nation, I'll be their God, and I'll be in covenant with them. When they go into the promised land, I'll be in covenant with them. I'm going to be with them. They are mine, and I'm going to watch over them. So the covenant of Abraham continues on. And he said to him, verse 7, and the Lord said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, turtle dove, and a young pigeon. I'm sorry, I misread that. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two down the middle, and he placed each piece opposite the other. So in other words, if you could see an animal standing like this, they cut it like this and spread it out flat, almost like you'd fillet a fish. Okay, but this is a full-grown bull. A bullock, and a goat, and okay, so they were cut in half and then separated and laid out side by side. Now this is the way they celebrated covenant. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two down the middle and placed each piece opposite the other. He did not cut the birds in two, and when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So he's standing there guarding this sacrifice to make sure that the birds didn't have a feast. Now, verse 12 says, and when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. Also the nation whom they serve I will judge afterwards, and they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you will be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not complete. So he said, I'm going to give you this land, but not you. Right now, it's going to be 400 years, and then your descendants will come and inherit this land, which is called the Promised Land. It's also, you recall, the land that eventually Joshua would take them into. Verse 17, and it came to pass when the sun went down, it was dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, Kenizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgasites, and the Jebusites. I had a Bible teacher that loved to rattle those names off. They're not easy on my tongue. But these were groups of people in the Promised Land, and they were going to be displaced. And so he's telling them, I'm going to give you the land, but right now these people have it, but they're going to work it and till it, and they're going to have gardens, and they're going to have wells, and they're going to have houses and so forth. I'm going to drive them out, and when you come in, you're just going to move in, set up shop, hang up your clothes, and go feed the chickens and fix breakfast in the morning. And so he was promising them this land. Now they didn't move according to God's will. So when they came to the Promised Land, they saw the giants and they were afraid and they didn't enter in. So they wandered for 40 years until there wasn't any place else to go. So then finally Joshua took them in. Now, so we fast forward on this Abrahamic covenant. Now let me stop there just for a moment. What happened was God was going to cut the covenant with Abraham. Here's God Almighty, and here's Abram, now not yet Abraham, Abram, and he says, you bring the sacrifice, and now the sun goes down, and it gets real dark, and all of a sudden, a lamp, a torch appears, Now, Abraham's knocked out over here. He's totally out of it. Just just like surgery, okay? And the same thing happened to Adam. He put Adam in a deep sleep, and he took his rib and created Eve. Okay, now, so here's Abram, and he is out of it, and this torch walks between the pieces of the animals, and this is how they performed covenant. This was well known to the people of that age. They understood exactly what was going on. The closest thing we have is marriage, a marriage covenant, but it's far removed. It's a long time ago that they entered into covenants. But God enters into covenant with Abram, and then we begin to see the effects of this covenant. We pick up in Genesis 17:1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. Now think about this for a moment. Here's this man, and he doesn't have any children of his own, except Ishmael, what was his wife talked him into this to have children by Hagar, the maid. And so God said, that's not the one I'm talking about. You're going to have a baby. Now, let me put this in perspective. He was 75 years old when he was promised. Sarah was just a little bit younger than him. So now, 25 years later, he was 99, okay? He's fixed to be 100 years old. She's just right behind him. Let's say 98, 99. I don't have the figure in front of me, but it is certainly well past childbearing age. So verse 7 says, I will establish my covenant between me and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I've given to you, your descendants after you, the land in which you're a stranger. Now Abraham wandered through this land, but he was not a permanent resident there. So later on they would occupy that land. All the land of Canaan is an everlasting possession, and I will be your God. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Okay, now this is talked about in the New Testament. So from Abraham right on through the birth of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, and now into the book of Acts, and they're talking about circumcision. Well, what's the deal? Well, that was the sign that they were going to keep the covenant. Okay, and then God was also going to give them a sign of the covenant. In other words, they were exchanging something. And so what Abram and his family would offer is that all the males would be circumcised. You say, wow, that's something. Yes, it is, because God on the other side is going to do something special. Now, Sarah at 99 years old, let's say, and Abraham at 100 years old, God's going to give them a son at that age. And this is pretty revolutionary. When you don't have any children, you're promised you're going to be a great nation, but you don't have any children. Is that cruel, or is that God making a promise? Now, let me look forward here. So he follows through on this. This is now down in 17, there's a lot of reading here, I apologize. So in verse 15 of Genesis 17:15, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarah thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of people shall come out of her. You say, wow, for a woman who's barren at the age of 99, that's a pretty big promise. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And he said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and Sarah is 90 years old? I'm sorry, I must have misread that. I must have misquoted that. It's 90 years old. That's still pretty old. Anyway, and Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, that's the son he had with Hagar, the servant girl. So as for Ishmael, I heard thee, behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make of him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this same time next year. So Abraham's going to be 100, Sarah's going to be 91, and they're going to have a son. His name is going to be Isaac. And they left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. Abraham took Ishmael his son, all were born in the house, and they brought with him money, every male men of Abraham's house, all circumcised the flesh and the foreskin, on that self-same day as God had said unto him. And Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised. In the self-same day Abraham was circumcised, and Ishmael his son, all the men of the house, born in the house. Now, the irony is, when Sarah heard this, she laughed. And so God picked up on this joke. And the joke was, okay, if you laugh and you think I can't do it, let's name him Laughter. Let's name him Ishmael. And so to remind them they had circumcision, to also remind Sarah and to remind Abraham, they now had a brand new baby at 91 and 100 years old. Now, think of this. Wow. Here's this covenant. Now, from that time, he says, you're not calling Sarai anymore. You're going to call her Sarah. And you're not going to be Abram anymore. You're going to be Abraham. Because God gave Abram his name. Who's the father of many nations? Well, he just got through a little bit before sending people into all the different parts of the earth and creating all the nations in one fell swoop by giving them all languages. So what's God's name? Well, he's the father of many nations. So he said, Abraham, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to rename you Abraham, the father of many nations. How you like that for a title? And I'm going to make that true. I'm going to make that come true. And then God says, oh, by the way, since we're in covenant now, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to be known it from now on, not as just God, but I'm going to be the God of Abraham. And when Isaac starts to grow up, I'm going to become the God of Abraham and Isaac. And when Jacob comes along, I'm going to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when I change Jacob's name to Israel, I'm going to become the God of the Israelites, the children of Israel. And I'm going to continue with them. And when they become two nations, Judah and Israel, then I'm still going to be the God of the children of Israel. Collectively, I'm going to be with them. And he does. And he keeps his commandment. He keeps his covenant, which we know as the Old Covenant. Now, so the Old Covenant has to do with the fact that God said, I'm not going to try to change all these nations. I'm going to let them go the way they want to go. But I'm going to pick one nation. I'm going to pick one man, and one man that can't have children in his own right. And the New Testament tells us that Abraham, whose body is now dead, he can't do this. So the miracle is he's beyond age, he can't do it. Sarah's beyond age, she can't do it. And God says, that doesn't matter to me. Doesn't matter to me. That's a part of the covenant. I told you you're going to be a great nation, and I'm going to do it. Now let's jump forward here a little bit now, because the Old Covenant brings us up to the New Covenant, or what you probably think of as the New Testament. So we want to look at that just for a moment, because the New Testament is about Jesus, and this changes everything. Everything changes, and so let me pick up on a couple of scriptures here. Mark 16:15, Jesus gives a command, and he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Okay, now wait just a minute. What's going on here? Because the covenant was with the children of Israel, the Jews, if you will. By this time, they begin to be called Jews during the time of their captivity. So now, so they're saying, wait a minute, we don't want to have anything to do with those other people. Jesus had an experience at the well of Samaria, and they didn't even talk to the Samaritans, which were half-breed people. They didn't have anything to do with them. They would go all the way around Samaria to keep them going and having any doings with them. But Jesus went and talked to this woman at Samaria. So she didn't know what he was doing. The disciples didn't know what he was doing. But he understood something that I want you to understand. Now let's go to Matthew 28. Okay, 28:18. And Jesus came and spoke unto them, saying, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Verse 19, go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. Wow, wait a minute, what's going on? All of a sudden, the covenant that brought us through the Old Testament to the New Testament now has been reversed. God says, now I'm going back and I'm going to reclaim those nations that I gave up on, and you're going to go and you're going to receive them. Jesus Christ is going to provide the way for you. He says, all power is given unto me, therefore you go. And you say, what's he talking about? Well, Jesus is going to defeat all those princes that rule over all those places, and he's given the disciples the commandment to go. Now, Matthew 24, he's so confident of that, he says these words. I mean, I want you to go, and here's what's going to happen. Matthew 24:14. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Wait a minute. What about all these pagan nations? Well, that's what the book of Acts is all about. Peter is confronted with the fact that God is now claiming authority over these nations. Wow. So what happened is Jesus came to fulfill the covenant that God made with himself from the foundation of the world. The Bible speaks of that several places, and we talked about that. But here's the thing. Jesus now breaks the power of these forces that ruled in a way that God didn't want, and he starts to set up his kingdom on earth as he prayed in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Now he tells the disciples, he tells the early church, I want you to go into all the world. Now, we don't talk a lot about this in church, but this is AD 30 when Jesus finished his ministry, dies on the cross, and is resurrected about AD 30. Now in AD 70, 40 years, and some of the disciples are still probably alive, he says, when you see these things begin to happen, the Emperor Titus surrounds Jerusalem, and when you see these things happen, don't go back in your house. If you're out in the field, don't come into the house. If you're on the roof of the house, don't come back into the house. Just leave from the roof, leave from the field, and go. Don't hesitate. And the disciples did exactly what Jesus said, and they left the city. The Jews were trapped, and it was a massacre. And Josephus tells us about that. You can look that up if you want. Look up AD 70, look up Jerusalem, the siege of Jerusalem, look up Emperor Titus, whatever. Anyway, just Google it and you'll find it. Now, and so they go into all the world like Jesus said. Why? Because God is reclaiming the nations that he lost. Now, if you look in the book of Revelation, I don't have it in my notes, but if you look in the Revelation, it says that every kindred, tribe, and tongue will be represented in the final analysis. Why? Because God gave up those nations and let them be deep in sin. And knowing that Jesus Christ would come, the old covenant brought Jesus Christ into being. He was born of a virgin and ministered and so forth, proved beyond all shadow of a doubt that he was the Son of God. And everyone who believed on him then was given the power to overcome the nations, and they would go out into the nations. If you read about the Apostle Paul, then you'll see names like Galatia, Thessalonica, Rome, I can't cut them off all off on the tip of my tongue here. But those were places that he went and preached the gospel and started churches. And he went back 2 or 3 times to encourage those believers and see thriving churches. Now, if you and I were to look at our Bible without the Pauline epistles, it would be a very, very different New Testament. It would be a very, very different theology. We have that because of Paul. And Paul understood what Jesus said to do, and that's to go into all the world. He took it very seriously because God, a long time ago, had confounded the nations with language so that they couldn't do what they wanted to do. And now that's reversed, Acts 2:4. And he gave them the gift of tongues to change this all around. Pentecost is a signal that God now is going to reach out to those nations. One little footnote before I close, and that is when Jesus went into the temple, he cleansed the part of the temple where they were selling sacrifices and money changers and so forth, and he didn't like that. He said, my house, call it a house of prayer for all peoples, but you've made it a den of thieves. Now, what was he doing? He was cleansing the part of the temple that the Jews did not think it was important, because that was the court of the Gentiles. And he says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples, and we got to clean this up, because my other peoples, Jesus said, I have other sheep that are not of this fold, and they will come. Now he cleanses the temple for the Gentiles, and then he says, I want you to go into all the world and tell them. Now, I'm trying to close here. Bear with me. When the people came to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, they heard the marvelous works of God. They stayed for a few days, a feast, and then they would go home. And those people were from all nations around the world. Think about this. If you look in Acts chapter 2, it reads all these nations. Dwellers at Rome and Pamphylia and Greece and all of these nations. It's just a whole laundry list of those nations where they were from. So where do you go when you go home? You go back where you're from. Now they go back and told the wonderful things about the Passover. Jesus Christ died and Jesus rose from the dead. They probably saw him alive, saw him go through the crucifixion, and knew that they buried him, and on the third day he came forth out of the grave, and they saw him. Now when they go back to their homes after the day of Pentecost, what are they going to say? And so they laid the foundation for when the apostles would come and preach the gospel, because God was going to fulfill the covenant for Abraham. I'm going to have all nations. And so we close. Thank you for joining us today. God bless you.